Most people carry a simple picture of money in their heads. If you ask them where dollars come from, they'd probably say something like, "The government prints it," as if there's a giant factory somewhere waiting for a politician to press a red button and start the presses. It's a comforting story. Straightforward. Almost childlike. The government needs money. The government makes money. The government spends money. But the awkward truth is, that story is wrong. In the modern American system, the government does not control how much money exists. It does not print the dollars it spends in any meaningful sense. That power, quietly, almost invisibly, sits inside a different institution, the Federal Reserve. And once you understand that, a strange question appears on the horizon, a question that should not exist in a healthy monetary story. If the Federal Reserve can create dollars out of thin air, who, exactly, does it owe them to? It's an uncomfortable question because it forces us to open a door most people never touch. We imagine that behind that door we'll find complicated equations, rooms full of PhDs, a system far too complex for ordinary people to grasp. But that's not quite true. On the other side, what you find is something surprisingly simple: a set of rules, a balance sheet, and a design that quietly shapes every paycheck, every loan, every tax bill. If you or I try to create money from nothing, we call it counterfeiting. If a private company tried it, we'd call it fraud. When the most powerful financial institution in the country does it, we give it a softer name: monetary policy. Most of us never notice the contradiction. We accept the dollar the way we accept gravity. It's there. It works. Don't overthink it. Until one day someone asks, who really controls the money? And that simple question, so small, so innocent, begins to crack a 100-year-old illusion. Because to answer it honestly, we can't start with today. We have to go back to the moment when this machine was first built, and a very different America decided who would hold the lever of its money. To understand how the dollar works today, we have to return to a time when money was fragile. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States lived through a series of banking panics. Farmers lost their savings overnight. Small-town banks closed their doors without warning. Crowds lined up on sidewalks, hoping their bank would still have cash when they reached the front of the line. Every few years, the financial system seemed to tear itself apart. Politicians, bankers, and business leaders argued over the cause. Some blamed reckless speculation. Others blamed the gold standard or the lack of a central authority. But on one point, a consensus slowly formed. The country needed a new kind of institution, something powerful enough to rescue banks in a crisis, and steady enough to anchor the financial system. In 1913, after months of closed-door meetings and fierce debate, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act on paper. Its purpose was clear: create a central bank to stabilize the system. In practice, it did something more subtle. It centralized the power to create money between the government and a network of private banks. The Federal Reserve was built as a hybrid: a board in Washington, regional banks spread across the country, and member banks that would hold shares in those regional institutions. Over the next decades, that structure evolved, and with it, the nature of the dollar itself. In 1933, during the Great Depression, Americans were ordered to turn in much of their gold. Gold coins vanished from everyday use. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar was placed at the center of the global monetary system, promising foreign governments they could convert dollars into gold. And in 1971, that last promise was broken. President Nixon closed the gold window, severing the link between the dollar and any metal at all. From that moment on, a dollar no longer represented a fixed quantity of gold. It represented something more abstract, a claim on the U.S. government, and a unit inside a system designed in 1913 and adjusted, crisis after crisis, for more than a century. Now the stage is set. We know where the institution came from. The real question is a practical one. In this modern system, how is a dollar actually created? To see how a dollar is born, forget, for a moment, the printing presses. In the modern system, most dollars are not printed at all. They begin their lives as numbers on a screen. It starts with a familiar problem. The government wants to spend more than it collects in taxes. That gap is called the deficit. To fill that gap, the U.S. Treasury issues bonds, pieces of paper, or digital entries that say essentially, "Lend us money now, and we'll pay you back later, with interest." These bonds are sold to investors, pension funds, foreign governments, banks. But when the Federal Reserve itself steps in as a buyer, something different happens. When the Fed decides to buy Treasury bonds, it doesn't dig into a vault full of savings. It doesn't sell something else to raise the cash. It simply creates new dollars by expanding the numbers on its own balance sheet. On the assets side, the Fed records the bonds it has just bought. On the liabilities side, it credits the banking system with newly created reserves. Those reserves are not piles of paper money. They are electronic entries, the kind of dollars that live only inside the banking system. Commercial banks now hold more reserves at the Fed. With those reserves, they can support more deposits and more lending. As they make loans, new bank deposits appear in people's accounts. Salary payments, mortgages, business credit. Those deposits are the dollars you and I experience in daily life. Card payments, transfers, balances in an app. Meanwhile, the Treasury has received the money from the sale of its bonds. It spends those funds into the real economy, on salaries, contracts, benefits, programs. That spending becomes someone else's income. But there is a catch, and it is built into the structure of the system. For every bond the Fed holds, the U.S. government now owes the principal plus interest at some point in the future. In other words, when money is created this way, it is born with a shadow attached, a debt that someone must one day pay. So, at its core, this is not just a story about numbers increasing on a screen. It is a story about obligations, who owes whom, and who gets paid as new dollars come into existence. Which leads to the next question, the one that rarely makes it into textbooks. In a system where money is born as debt, who ultimately profits from that design? If every dollar is born with a debt attached, then somewhere in the system, someone is on the receiving end of the payments. Start with the obvious piece. The U.S. government pays interest on the bonds it has issued, including the ones held by the Federal Reserve. Where does that money come from? Primarily from taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, the everyday flow of revenue collected from workers, businesses, and consumers. When the Treasury pays interest on the bonds held by the Fed, those payments become part of the Fed's income. From that income, the Federal Reserve pays its operating costs, staff, systems, buildings, and then, by law, it pays dividends to its member banks. Those member banks are private institutions that hold shares in the regional Federal Reserve banks. Their dividend is limited by statute, but it still represents a return on being part of the central banking structure. Only after those obligations are met does the Fed send the remainder of its profits back to the U.S. Treasury. So the picture is more nuanced than all the money disappears into private hands. But there is still a clear pattern. Interest on money created from nothing flows first into the central bank, and from there partly into the private banking system that surrounds it. There is another, deeper layer. In a system where most money is created as the byproduct of lending, if all debts were suddenly paid off, government, corporate, household, most of the money we use would vanish from circulation. Banks would have fewer loans and therefore fewer deposits. The government would have no bonds outstanding. The balance sheets would shrink, and so would the money supply. The architecture quietly requires a certain level of permanent debt to keep enough money in the system. That design has consequences. It means the economy must constantly roll over old debts, issue new ones, refinance, expand. It means that the flow of interest payments, from households with mortgages, from businesses with loans, from governments with bonds, remains a steady stream into the financial institutions that hold those claims. For more than a century, this has been the logic wired into the dollar. Money as debt, interest as constant, and a structure that channels value from the many who use the currency to the institutions that help create and manage it. Most people will never see this machine, but every time you earn, borrow, spend, or pay taxes, you move inside its gears. Understanding it doesn't instantly change the system, but it does change something important: the story you tell yourself about what money really is and who it ultimately serves.